had to deal with a special event back in the United States and was late getting here. He is here. He just ringed me. He's a few minutes away. But since he told me he was going to have me start this off, then rather than wait too long, why don't I do just that? So you know me, Richard Gingras. I have been involved in the digital arena for, well, I've been involved in the intersection of media, technology, and public policy for a terrifyingly long 5 decades, which, by the way, I want to point out, doesn't mean I know all the answers. It just means that I've made far more mistakes than any of you, and hopefully have learned along the way. But part of my own fascination along that journey was to understand the impact of media technology on society. And so I like to dig in deep with that. And a few years ago, in partnership with Marty Barron, Maria Ressa, we actually created a global research institute that thinks of itself in a sense as a think tank for the role of journalism in society. And so important that we dig into these things and dig deep into understanding why we are where we are in our world today. I think one rather terrifying fact is that over the last 15 years, electoral democracies have elected authoritarians in 15 countries, right? Why is that? And to what extent is that a result of the media space, the internet? Some people say, oh, it's because of social networks. And there's validity to that, but the fact is, it began far earlier than that. So I want to start just by isolating 2 key factors which I think got us to where we are today. One thing I think that's important to recognize is that with the evolution of media from the printing press on, it's always been disruptive. Gutenberg in the printing press was disruptive. Without the printing press, Martin Luther would not have been able to trigger the Reformation. Without the printing press, we wouldn't have had the shared technical knowledge for the Industrial Revolution to happen. So there are good impacts and troubling impacts. One thing about the evolution of communications technology, be it the printing press, broadcasting, television, cable, satellite, the internet, is with every progression of the access to communications technology, you create opportunity for more voices, you create opportunity for more perspectives, and you create opportunities for more conflict, right? At every step of the way, that has been true. There has never been a golden age of truth as much as we would like to think that's the case. And there's no question that the internet really accelerated that in a significant way. And as a result, if you have that many voices and perspectives, that much conflict, it makes it much more difficult to reach consensus in a society. It makes it much more difficult for democracies to be functional. And it makes it much easier for the society to fall prey to the authoritarian who says, yeah, democracy's chaotic, it doesn't really work, we have the answers, right? And people gravitate towards that. Interestingly, this was predicted by the Greeks. Plato predicted this, right? They always felt that democracy was the least worst form of government, but they felt it was the right way. But he also noted that, again, democracies are chaotic, and pointed out that democracies would fall prey to the freedoms they enable, meaning free expression, ultimately the free press. And ultimately, that's what we're seeing. So there's this interesting paradox between access to expression and the ability of a society to find consensus and operate in an open and democratic fashion. That's point one. The other interesting point is I've had a long fascination with the work of a social behavior researcher by the name of Robert Putnam. And he began his work here in Italy in the 70s. Because in the 70s, Italy went to provincial governments. And some were effective and some were less effective. And they brought in Robert Putnam to study this, and he did a massive array of studies and found that the single correlating factor between an effective government and an ineffective government was community engagement. And by that, he didn't mean community engagement in civil society. He didn't mean community engagement in politics. He meant simply community engagement. Right? He wrote a book in early 1990 called Bowling Alone. Are you joining bowling leagues? Right? Are you joining the garden club? Are you meeting people who aren't like you? Right? That was really the key factor. That didn't start with the internet. It did start with television, because starting in the 60s and 70s, you had households watching television for 5-6 hours a day. Thus, they weren't going on picnics. They weren't going outside. They weren't meeting each other. And so, a powerful correlation between community engagement and effectiveness of democracies. So that's our problem set. And I think it's important to recognize that. How do we address it? And I think there are lots of ways to address it. But my key thesis, which I wrote about, was that it's up to us in the world of journalism to absorb those learnings and say, what does that mean for us in terms of how we perform our work? What does it mean for us as we seek to earn and re-earn the respect of the societies we seek to serve? You know, often in the last 15 years, because of the disruption of the internet, people say, well, it's all about the business model, it's all about the money. If we had the money, everything would be good. I don't buy that. I don't think that's true at all. Because of the factors we cited, right? So many more voices, so many more opinions. How do we bring people together? With this session, we wanted to talk specifically about local news. So I'll just have a few more comments here, and I want to turn to Jim. Because in my own view, the most powerful dimension of a society where we can impact this challenge is at the community level. But I think, in my understanding, that requires us to rethink, in an opportunistic way, what it means to be a local media property, what it means to be a local news property in a community. How do you bring people together, right? And where I see success in that regard is where we're seeing emerging publishers who are looking at that and saying, yeah, we have to rethink this. You know, yes, accountability journalism is important, but how do we serve the full information needs of the community, right? Service journalism, that important news that you can use in a community, is powerful. It's what drives engagement. In fact, I came across a phrase that I hadn't heard recently, who described service journalism as cohesion journalism. Because that information, whether it's about the weather, whether it's what's going on in the community park, whether it's the new business that opened, or the struggling nonprofit that needs help, that's what helps build a shared reality. And if we can't build a shared reality, we can't find that consensus. If we don't create opportunities for people to meet each other virtually and physically, we don't have that effect of, do I understand people who are not like me, right? And that's a, you know, I think, for instance, if I look at the issue of gay marriage, and I have a daughter who's gay and married, if you look at the data, because it's fascinating how that evolved in many countries, people's views change about gay marriage when they have direct relationships to people who are gay, right? A friend, a member of the family, because you develop a very different sense of empathy, right? You have an understanding of them. You're less likely to drop into that silo of fear, whether it's about immigrants, new ethnicities coming into your community, or gay marriage, or whatever, right? If we can't seek to address that, if we can't seek to bring societies together in that fashion, then how do we ever address the divisiveness and polarization in our society? So that's the core thesis, at least in my analysis, you know, and I'm not saying all my answers are correct. My main objective in crafting that piece and in talking to folks like Jim, who goes back almost as far as I do in this space, is how do we trigger the conversations in the journalism community to step back and say, how do we reassess what we do, right? Our principles shouldn't change, but our methods might change. How we approach talking about the issues that we cover might change. Again, don't know the answers, but I think it's important for all of us to have those discussions, drive those discussions, ask ourselves those questions. One thing I've learned over the years is if you're looking for answers, Step one is keep asking questions, keep going deeper to understand the problem, and that might lead you to a better understanding of the problem and a better understanding of the possible solutions. And with that, I want to introduce Jim Brady, my partner here. Thank you for making it. You just landed, I take it, right here in
Yeah, I landed this morning. I have not slept in about 36 hours, which is why I went to the original venue location for this. So if I'm a little out of breath, it's because I had to haul ass over here. I want to talk a little bit about, Richard mentioned if we had all the money in the world. You know, we kind of did at one time. In the 80s and 90s and 2000s, we had, you know, huge profit margins for newspapers, especially in television stations doing well. But I would still argue like we were not fully in touch with our communities when we had those big margins. I think, you know, when we launched new sections of newspapers, they were often designed to make more money. They were a travel section, a home section, a health section. You know, these were driven not by the audience or the readers saying, we want this section. They might have been happy to read it. I'm not saying they didn't want it, but they weren't explicitly asking for it. We recognized that if we launched these sections, there was a lot of money to be had, and we could turn our 25% margins into 30% margins, and that was great. But it wasn't because we were asking the community that much what they wanted, and I think that's the world we're in now. As the ad dollars went away to be replaced by reader revenue significantly, like you sure better be asking your readers what it is they want, because they're the ones paying the freight now in a way they just weren't 30 years ago. So I do think that's forced us into a much more closer relationship, or at least forced us to start exploring how close we can get to the audience, because if they're not happy, you're going to feel that in your revenue lines and your ability to stay sustainable. I'll say too that one of the reasons I think democracy is struggling so much right now is I actually do think it's the lack of local news, and it's not just because people don't know what's going on in their own community, but the lack of local news keeps people from knowing about things they actually could do something about. Something they could go to a city council meeting, they could go to a school board meeting, they could go do something that would make their community better. But because they don't know that opportunity exists, they don't take it. They can't take an opportunity you don't know about. And I feel like they get dragged into these national issues that they can do nothing about. And I feel like it creates this intense frustration of a lot of news consumers who get really annoyed about all these things beyond their control, and yet, right in their backyard, there's a bunch of things they probably could do if there was a healthy local media ecosystem telling them what those opportunities are. And so I do think part of the solution of the democracy problem that we're having in the US at the moment is just a stronger local news ecosystem and keep people engaged in places where they can be active and take action and feel like they're contributing to a democracy. I feel like a lot of people just feel like they're not able to contribute to it at this point because everything is just a little bit beyond their reach. And you know, they get riled up by national news that is meant to rile them up. I think if you look at the economic model for national news in the United States, division is a very powerful driver of revenue. If you're Fox or MSNBC, you can take 360 million people, write off half of them. As long as you can turn some percentage of the other half into addicts, you can make a lot of money. But if you're working in markets of 100,000 people and 400,000 people and 2 million people, you can't afford to just write off half the market by being particularly partisan. Most local television stations, local newspapers do try to stick to more of the traditional journalism values, which we could talk about that. That's a whole other issue. There's a question about whether all generations still want that. But at least in terms of building a business, I think the idea of not becoming too partisan and less divisive is probably a better business model locally. And I think that provides some hope, but we certainly have a long road in front of us.
Yeah. You know, in fact, in that regard, I sometimes think that as journalists, it's important to step back and rethink what is our mission. I've made the comment to some, again, specific to North America, that I feel like the journalism community is suffering somewhat from the Woodward-Bernstein effect. That we think that the ideal objective of journalism is to hold power to account, right? Is to write that great investigative story that takes down the politician who's misbehaving. And obviously that's of critical importance. I don't want to dilute that at all. But it has to be more than that, right? So when I think about the mission of journalism, I think, is the mission of journalism not about us strengthening the communities we serve? Right? Which means not only unveiling the misbehavior, but also expressing your confidence and belief in the strength of that community in doing everything you can to make it stronger, right? Are we covering the goodness in our community where some civic organization or individual is doing an act of kindness for someone else? Are we showing the value of empathy in our community, right? I think that's pretty critical. And there too, I think if we think in that broader sense, it even has an impact on the business models, right? You saw yesterday the session, if you went, and I mentioned it in the piece, I talk about Village Media up in Canada, who I think is being so supremely thoughtful about this. Jeff Elgie is with us today. I've worked with him for 10 years. In fact, I so believe in what he does that I've joined his board, right? But it's just that approach of how do we address broad community needs? How do we create opportunities for their engagement? And by the way, if you address broad community needs, it makes the business model work a whole lot better. I've been doing work in a couple of cities. I've been doing work in Chicago, and we did some research recently on why do people consume local news. You know what the #1 motivation was? To save money. They want to understand, you know, where are the good deals in my community? You know, oh, that new restaurant that's, you know, something I can afford. That's important, right? That's important. In fact, if you think about advertising at the community level, that's important information to the community, right? Helps them understand what's on offer. So it's powerful, and it helps drive the business model. So Village Media is profitable, has no paywalls, and it's entirely driven by the sale of local advertising. But that would not work if you didn't take that very comprehensive view of the information needs of the community. And in fact, if you do, one thing I've been strongly suggesting journalists do, and Jim and I talk about this a lot because we have a lot of emerging nonprofits, and I have no problem with a nonprofit, but I say, and they're doing accountability journalism, and I ask them, are you doing the research on the demand side to understand the information needs of your community? Because if you do that, what you'll find, not surprisingly, getting accurate local weather information is really important, right? Understanding the traffic conditions is really important. Understanding what's going on in the community park is really valuable to me, right? And by the way, those needs far outstrip their theoretical interest in accountability journalism and what's happening at the city council, and that's important. But here too, the power of the model, if you do this right, because if you do the analysis, the level of interest in serious accountability journalism is very, very low. You look at the Reuters reports, it's like down in the single digits. But if you look at the interest in the broader categories of news you can use, it's much higher than that. And by doing that, you actually expose people to the accountability journalism they would not have otherwise sought out. So curiously, it has a multiplier effect on the impact of your accountability journalism if you can take that broader approach. So again, I think it's doing those assessments, understanding the needs of the community, understanding how you can address these needs in a polarized society, addressing the value of being as impartial as you can possibly be. Like I raise the question often with media entities today, why are you doing political endorsements? Maybe that made sense 75 years ago. Does it make sense today? You know, here you are doing powerful fact-based journalism, trying to convince people to trust you, but you surround it by opinion or an endorsement that suggests that you have a partisan lean, right? And you look at the research there, right? The New York Times is a profoundly good fact-based news organization, but if you look at the research, a lot of people will say fake news, left-leaning. Right? So do we need to think about these issues of how do we earn trust across the political spectrum, right? Not just on one side versus the other. You know, when I look at the challenges we face in a polarized world, the last thing I believe we need is more partisan journalism, because that's winner take all, and that terrifies me.
I saw All the President's Men when I was 9, and got into journalism because of that movie, and I thought Woodward and Bernstein were both cooler than Darth Vader, but that's why I'm in journalism. But I also agree with what Richard said. I think that kind of journalism is crucial and it's really important. I worked at the Washington Post for almost 20 years. But part of what makes investigative journalism work, part of what made Watergate, well, it took a while for it to explode, but when it did, is the Washington Post was already read by hundreds of thousands of people every day for 100 other reasons. And whatever reason they were reading the Post, they saw those stories every morning on the front page of the paper for a while, and that gave that story a lot of legs. And I feel like what we have now is a lot of investigative sites doing good work, but doing it with tiny audiences, and it's hard for them to get that momentum because they just don't have the eyeballs. And you're in if the Washington Post wrote an A1 story about something going on in the mayor's office in Washington, D.C., the mayor's office did something before noon. And now I think a lot of public officials just wait to see, does this thing have enough juice to actually make me need to do something, or can I survive this? And I think it's because the audiences are just not big enough. And I think that's part of, at night, we do a lot of funding of local journalism. We're experimenting right now, funding like sports and arts coverage and business coverage. Let's start figuring out how we can fund some coverage that actually will give those investigative sites a little bit more weight so that people do start to see them as something they can visit more than once a week, or when they hear about a story that got published, give them something a little thicker that they can go read so that those eyeballs do start to mass around those. Now, that's a long process. It may work, it may not work, but I think that's a real problem that we have, is that the investigative work and that kind of habitual daily stuff like comics and horoscopes and TV listings that used to be in the paper, if they're in the paper at all anymore, are often in a newspaper that doesn't really have the investigative chops they used to have. And so you've separated these things in a way that's kind of reduced the kind of combined impact. And I think figuring out how to deal with that problem is something that I think we got to do.
Yeah. And sometimes we miss, like, believe it or not, obituaries still matter in a local publication. In fact, Jeff will tell you that they get more traffic than the accountability journalism. Yeah. But that's real, right? The cycles of birth and death are important in our society.
What's funny, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
There was a publisher on a session I was at Online News Association in Atlanta last year. And he said something that sounded kind of like, I heard it, I kind of did the tilty head for a second, but I thought it actually makes some sense. Because the great thing about doing all of this sports and all, it's like, if you get 150 high school sports scores right on Friday night, people tend to believe you when you cover city council. And when they drive by that restaurant that you wrote burned down and they see that it actually burned down, or they see the things that you wrote about actually happened, they start to believe you in the things where they're not in the room. And so you build it up with a lot of that repetition of just covering local sports and covering restaurant openings and covering highway closures and things that they can lay their own eyes on and say, they got that right, they got that right, they got all that right. And so then you start to trust them when they're doing things you don't see. And I just thought that was an interesting perspective, but a lot of the accountability organizations don't really do much other than the accountability stuff, and it makes it a little bit harder to build that, not trust isn't the right word, to build that habit of just believing that, this is an organization that gets it right. And
I mean, if there's a specific actionable recommendation I often make to folks is, don't be afraid to ask the community what they're interested in. Don't be afraid to ask the community what they think of you. And I don't mean a nice little listening session where you're more likely to hear what you want to hear. I mean real research. And I actually did a piece about this several years ago about the value of research. And I understand, I've been in the business a long time. Newsrooms tend to be suspicious about marketing and research and so on and so forth. And indeed, a very dear friend of mine who was managing editor of the Los Angeles Times said, Richard, I disagree with you. I know the needs of my community in Los Angeles. And I wasn't sure how to answer that because I didn't want to insult my dear friend. And so what I simply said was, wait a second, you're a reporter. And my understanding is that you ask a lot of questions before you reach a conclusion. So why don't you ask those questions of your community? And maybe that's exactly what you thought they were, but maybe there's a slightly different angle and perspective that might help you tune what you do to be more useful and valued and respected by them. Don't be afraid of that. It's incredibly useful. In fact, it can help you tell you not just their information needs, it can help you identify problems that you may not have discovered in the community, right? What a nice cycle that is.
There's another piece to this, too, that I think is worth noting is the transparency piece. And I mentioned on a panel I did earlier this morning that It was a Gallup poll, I think, for about 2 years ago that said 74% of U.S. citizens thought that local news was in good economic shape. Like they just thought that local news was fine. And meanwhile, we're all in this business like, you out of your mind? It's been a hellish 2 decades, and 3/4 of the public thinks that we're doing well. And, you know, the easy, lazy response to that is to say those morons, right? It's like, but I think their truer response is, I don't know that we did a very good job at telling them what kind of trouble we were in. I don't think the newspapers, I'll speak to newspapers specifically because that's where I spent most of my career, did a very good job of acknowledging what was happening inside their own newsrooms. I mean, I used to drive me crazy when I worked at the Post and would see all these headlines about somebody laying off 30 people somewhere and couching it as part of our digital transformation. It's like, it's not part of your digital transformation. You can't afford these 30 people anymore. Why don't you just say that? Maybe the consumer would actually have a little sympathy, and maybe you might be able to get them to pay more for a subscription or get them to become a member if you would just be open about the fact you're struggling. And I think one of the things that I used to hear all the time when I worked at papers where the paper was getting smaller is, why am I paying 4 times as much for something that's half as big as it used to be? Like, the paper's getting thinner and thinner and the price is getting thicker and thicker. And a lot of people just didn't get that's because the advertising was going away and the only way to make the money now was to lean on the consumer more. But we didn't really explain that ever. We just kind of did it. And as people canceled, our response to that was not to be open with them. It was to make it as hard as possible to cancel. It was to make them jump through hoops and can't cancel online, got to pick up the phone and spend an hour clicking on buttons. You know, it's like we tortured people who wanted to cancel instead of trying to just like have a conversation with them and maybe make the product better. So I think like we have to own some of that too, and I think part of the path forward has to be a much more open, transparent relationship with consumers so that in 5 years, if we're still in economic trouble, at least we might have the success of 3/4 of people at least now knowing that we're struggling rather than the other way around, because people don't know to help, they're not going to help.
You know, in fact, another really fascinating thing in that regard that I uncovered in doing a lot of this exploration was, if you buy the notion that it's important for us to reach across the political divide, then it's also important to think and rethink the language you use. There's an extraordinarily thoughtful researcher at the University of Florida by the name of Janet Coates, and she's been studying linguistics in journalism. Politicians spend a lot of money studying linguistics. What's the absolute precise phrase they can use to trigger your hopes or fears? But we don't do this in the world of journalism, right? But she's been doing that. One big study she did was about the coverage of the George Floyd murder and their protests in Minneapolis. And what she found across the board in the coverage, not parts, across the board, was the use of adjectives like fury with regard to the protest, fury, ignite, erupt. All these terms that suggested violent confrontation that wasn't really the case. But we come to common terms of usage often in our coverage. And so her point was, she says, I think a lot of this is subconscious. But you don't realize it until somebody points it out to you, right? So there too, can we kind of think further about how we do that to convey the importance of our coverage, but to convey it in the fashion that, as I like to say, we'll inform you, you decide. Right? We're not going to tell you what to think. We're going to guide you with the fact-based information conveyed in a thoughtful way to help you come to your own conclusions. But that also means being careful about what perceptions you trigger based on the language that you use.
I was going to say, too, if anybody has questions or just wants to get up and tell us we're full of crap, feel free to do so.
Please.
Oh, sure, I'm sorry, we jumped ahead. Sorry.
Thank you for today. My name is Emre Kızılkaya. I'm a media researcher and former journalist based in Istanbul, Turkey. Empirical evidence cited by reputable sources such as Reuters, BBC, ProPublica has demonstrated algorithmic bias by Google against independent news outlets in Turkey in recent years. The most recent changes to the Google News and Google Discover algorithms have significantly impacted these outlets, independent ones. They culminated in the closure of Gazete Duvar, which was one of the country's largest independent newsrooms, due to a sharp decline in digital advertising revenues just last month. Number of news sources recommended by Google to Turkish users keep decreasing, the data also show. And the Journalists Union of Turkey, the largest representative body of independent media professionals in Turkey, has sent a formal letter to you, sir, regarding this matter, which I will hand it to you just after this session. So the situation stands in stark contrast with Google's stated commitments elsewhere, like in the US, in the EU. Turkey is not an EU member, of course, where the company emphasizes the importance of original journalism repeatedly. In Turkey, however, Google has consistently declined to engage with independent media representatives, despite repeated outreach, as the Erdogan government's crackdown on press freedoms continues to intensify each day. The Google Turkey director, for instance, keeps meeting with Erdogan's men, even the commander of the troll army of Erdogan's political disinformation campaign. So my question is for Mr. Gingras. In your Medium article, you refer to leaders with a more principled view of the common good. In that context, as journalism is a common good, do you believe as a leader of information ecosystem, is Google doing enough to support fragile democracies around the world? And more specifically, why does Google not apply its own rules and enforce its quality standards in Turkey? As a global gatekeeper of digital content distribution, is Google unwilling to ensure a level playing field for independent journalism in Turkey and similar countries? Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. That's obviously, I don't know that specific situation. And by the way, I'm no longer in charge of those things. Not to suggest that it wouldn't have happened had I been. As I often tell people, you know, the algorithmic work that we do is never finished. Right? The ecosystem changes. Our understanding of the ecosystem changes. The nature of the news ecosystem in various countries changes. And how do we change with it? And we don't always get it right. Right? I mean, we've had very focused initiatives the last several years to continue to try to catch up with these things. For instance, we're seeing around the world many more new emerging news organizations. Are we aware of their existence? Are we surfacing them appropriately? I wouldn't say by any means across the board that we're getting that right. I'm sure there are lots of instances where it's not the case, right? And in truth, it's only when we get kind of this kind of feedback do we kind of say, oh, maybe that is going on there. It is a constant process, and it's a constant process that we have to revisit in every domain around the world. Original journalism. My team spent 2 years trying to do a better job of original journalism, and I think we do a much better job than we did. Right? But it's an interesting challenge, specifically with original journalism, right? Because, you know, there's this competitive nature in the world of journalism, right? You've got one news organization breaks the story with this big original story, and then 2 hours later, the competitor across town covers the story as well. Maybe they add some fresh content, right? And so it's that interesting balance of providing the freshest coverage while also trying to identify and give credit to the source that did it originally, right? But it's a tricky thing, right? So again, I will accept criticism because I know we don't always get it right. But it is a constant work of progress that we just have to keep at it and keep at it and keep at it. I like to think we get better every day. But then again, the ecosystem changes, and we need to catch up, right? So again, that's not at all to excuse when we don't get it right. We try, I think, to be as principled and responsible as we possibly can, particularly in this polarized world, right? I woke up in 2017 with Donald Trump saying, you know, our algorithms were biased against the right, right? And my best answer for that was because we don't do any assessments of political lean on the part of the publication or on the part of the user, but it's simply to say we do our best to surface diverse perspectives from diverse sources, right? Now, I said that to a group of right-wing think tanks who said to me, Richard, we believe you, except that the journalistic ecosystem is biased against the right. And I went, almost suggesting that we needed to be fair and balanced in our understanding of the ecosystem to surface those. So again, it's an interesting struggle and a constant challenge. And I will accept that feedback and send it back to the team.
Thank you. Can I ask, from your work on this and looking at examples of success in terms of local news, have you seen the best success emerging from sort of community-led innovation and, in a sense, from the market in different communities? And I work for the BBC. We obviously, our sort of raison d'etre is the idea of bringing people together at a national level and at a local level, and the value for all the reasons you've discussed of shared understanding, shared moments, shared national and local experiences, and so on. But again, obviously in Europe, similarly, there are a commercial crisis in local news coverage, local newspapers, lots of the same factors as the US, but Europe is obviously different. We have public media in a different way. There are examples of the BBC in different European countries. And we're all kind of struggling with this model of public media similarly serving in local communities and how that works. So I was just interested in your perspectives, obviously, on that difference that there is between Europe and the US, and how that relates to the market and innovation and what works.
You know, in my own assessment, I mean, innovation is hard. We toss that word around. It's hard. It's particularly hard in a disrupted environment. Right? When I look at legacy publishers, some of them who are so vastly successful that they didn't really have to even think about the market. You know, in fact, I look at a lot of legacy publishers, and when the internet happened, they just thought that was another simple way to distribute their content without changing anything. And I went, wait a second, the marketplace for information changed dramatically. And the people who used to go to the fashion section to find out what was on sale in the department stores are now going to completely different sites. You know, so are you doing that kind of analysis to understand what kind of products you need to build to fit that market? But innovation is hard. I like to think, you know, I always look to identify who are the leading lights that others might follow. Because also, if you look at media history, with the introduction of every new medium, it wasn't clear what the right models were for that medium. Radio, for instance, what's the right programming format? And obviously there's several, but after 5 or so years, people understand, oh, I can do top 40 radio, I can do all talk, and then all of a sudden people understand and they pick the template that's right for them. So I hope that's ultimately where we get in this space, as we see enough examples of success that others will follow that. In fact, you know, what I've often cited, and again, I try to identify successful players and expose them to others, is when it comes to ecosystem change, to me, the most critical emotion is envy. Show them a successful model that they envy and that they might be willing to follow, right? Because we all can't reinvent the wheel, and if someone has reinvented the wheel, then fine, let's take it and run with it. You know, I look at today and I say, like, you know, why should any evolving news organization several years from now need any technical expertise on their staff? Right? There should be rich platforms that they can simply take, such that their focus is on doing the great work of doing the journalism, engaging with their communities. But it takes time to get there. It takes time to get there. And I don't mean when I suggest, again, I just repeat this, how important it is to innovate, how important it is to question our own assumptions about things. I don't want to suggest for a second that that's easy.
If I was going to say what I think the most common theme is among successful ventures in the U.S. and the local news space, it might sound counterintuitive, but it's good business leadership. I just think we have a real dearth of really strong business leaders who come out of journalism. It's just not natural for, you know, some people have the skill to do it, but they really want to cover it. They want to be out reporting. They're not interested in sitting in sales meetings and trying to raise money and all those tough things. But when you see a site that's successful or an organization that's successful, usually at the top you see somebody who's a great leader, not just because they can run the business. And Jeff's one of the best out there. I mean, he really is. Anybody who's looking for tips should really talk to Jeff. But it's also that they innovate. It's that they're not afraid to try new things. They're also good at managing the business. And sometimes those leaders come from outside journalism. You know, we actually are funding a program at a university in the US right now to actually try to get people from other nonprofit sectors into journalism. Because if you run a healthcare nonprofit or an education nonprofit, you have some of the basics of running the business, and that's really what we need in a lot of cases. And I also think with that comes with that, a good business leader also comes with some ability to take risks. I mean, I was just realizing that this month is not 30 years in digital journalism for me. I got into digital journalism in April 1995, so I'm getting up there. And one of the common themes of the last 30 years in digital journalism is the media. We tend to see every new thing as a threat first and an opportunity second, and we have missed so many opportunities because of that. And I think the good leaders are the ones who see AI and don't think immediately about copyright and don't think immediately about my contents being stolen, but think about how AI can help produce amazing journalism, go through public records in a flash, automate newsroom tasks, transcribe what's being said on state houses around the country, around the world. Like, if you look at it that way and say this thing could be a lifesaver for us as opposed to immediately deciding how it's going to screw our business over, I think you can be successful. So that's what I mean, when we look to invest in things at Knight Foundation, I mean, we're looking at leadership really, really closely, because a great idea with someone who just is not that interested in running the business is going to stay, well, it won't stay a great idea. It'll eventually become probably a failed idea. So that, to me, is a really core theme. Yes, you have to have good journalists underneath that business leader, but the truth is, like, there's really a lot of good journalists out there. We have more of them than we have of really strong business leaders.
In fact, I've often joked, because in the United States, so many of the emerging players were founded by journalists, and that's wonderful and it's very noble, but they don't understand the business. They have this innate distaste for advertising, and as I joke, they would rather eat worms than sell an ad, right? And that's an unfortunate thing, because that's an opportunity missed.
Yeah. We also, by the way, encouraged that for a lot of years.
Yeah.
That was like, when I
Question.
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Kevin Anderson, recovering journalist who now works for a company that builds 400 apps for 130 publishers around the world. A quick comment, because it really doesn't matter who I am, that you might know, Andy Haldane and David Halpern in the UK did a paper for Demos that used the concepts of Robert Putnam. And they calculated that if the UK had Scandinavian levels of trust, it would add £100 billion annually to GDP. So now to the question. You manage what you measure. What metrics could we introduce into a journalism workflow or into a journalism business that would measure increase in social capital so that we could actually manage that as an output of the process?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
I would cite a couple of things. And I might even turn to Jeff and say because they study this stuff a lot. On the matter of trustworthiness, one thing I've often encouraged is, to me, the ideal measure of trust is, because in a sense, a partisan news organization, trust is largely about affinity, right? And so to me, my ideal measure of trust is, if you're doing that assessment, is when you're doing that survey, get the respondent to identify their political lean, and then look at what they say about trust. Because to me, the ideal measure is, are you earning trust across the spectrum? Not just with one side versus the other, but across the spectrum. I think in terms of social capital, I think that's, I don't know quite how to measure it. Is it about community engagement? Now, some of that, I mean, Jeff, for instance, has this marker in his communities that he wants daily usage from 25% of the community. That's a really big number, right? But to the extent that you can drive that depth of reach and engagement, that says something about the derived social capital that might come from that. But I think it's a really good question, and I would actually love to explore how one, and if you've got analysis or thoughts about how you measure social capital, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I read the upswing. I think there's about a few ideas, but I'm working on this. I read the upswing after the election because I wanted to make sense of what the hell had happened. And I would say it's a tour de force in social research, and there are metrics that he uses in terms of, there's obviously community participation and things like that that go through, but it's even, there's other things like how many picnics do people have? I mean, but it is to say that there are a lot of measures that you might be able to adapt and which would be appropriate to an editorial organization and which would be, probably external and maybe something you'd partner with a local university so that you'd have if you had a local community health barometer or something, you partnered with a local university, for instance. Just some thoughts. But, my wife and I are trying to organize a Join or Die watch party in Reading, UK, so that we can do some work on this. So thanks.
No, I think that last point you meant about, assessing community health, I think is spot on.
Well, thank you all for coming, and apologies from me for being a couple minutes late. Thank you for being here. We are out of time.
I totally misread Chris's note when he moved it. I thought he said he was keeping it.
Thank you very much.